You sit down, ready to watch the sequel to a movie that you loved. Excitement fills you as thoughts of following your favorite characters on a new adventure dream of the possibilities. There's so much that could happen given where they were at the end of the previous movie, and given the amazing growth of the protagonist throughout that one. But early on, as you're watching, you begin to notice similarities to the other movie. Sure, there are some differences, a new antagonist, or a different location, or a slightly altered setup, but the main plot, the character's whole story arc, is exactly the same as the first film. It's like they never even went through all those struggles before. They have to learn it all over again. This is a problem with sequels that most of us have seen at least a few times in our lives. Those tales where the writers failed to cover new ground with their own characters. Where it was easier to just give the protagonist amnesia concerning the previous story, instead of further developing them as a complex character with a need for various areas of growth. While this might leave us feeling unfulfilled when it comes to stories of fiction, the truth is that in our own lives we might need a few times before the lesson being taught is fully impressed upon us. Or the lesson might not be easily applied given this new change of circumstance. And we need to learn to do it over again. In our passage for this sermon, 1 Samuel chapter 25, in our series called A Song of Failures and Hope, we will witness David seem to have to learn the same lesson as he did in our previous sermon. And, spoilers for the next sermon, we'll see it again for a third time in chapter 26. Only this time the antagonist who stands as David's mirror and foil isn't Saul. If you recall in chapter 24, David had been on the run from Saul for a while. He'd just been given a second to breathe before his father-in-law was at his heels again. As Saul sought David in order to kill him, the rejected king just so happened to need to have to take a potty break right in the very cave that David and his men were hiding. David crept close enough to Saul that he could reach out and stab him. But in that moment something struck David's heart, something that stayed his hand from violence. And that thing was the recognition of the fact that if he were to do that violent act that he set out to do, he would be acting in the same wickedness that sent Saul to kill him. He would be working his own will instead of joining God in his work in this world. And so, in recognition of the fact that God's chosen king will reign as God wills, David let Saul leave unharmed, and then bowed in humble service to Saul, an act which struck Saul enough to leave David alone, for now. But as we turn to 1 Samuel chapter 25, we come to a very similar lesson for David. Only this time it will focus on the very end part of the theme that we're following as we go through the book of Samuel. Despite the problems of this life and the human evil that brings them about, God's king will reign and bring restoration to his humble people. Yet before we get too far into this whole thing, let's look at the passage's introduction of when, where, and who. 1 Samuel chapter 25, verses 1 to 3. Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him. And they buried him in his house at Ramah. Then David rose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. And there was a man in Maon, whose business was in Carmel. The man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now the name of the man was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. The woman was discerning and beautiful, but the man was harsh and badly behaved. He was a Calebite. In the first 3 words of the passage, we witness the completed end of Samuel's story arc. Although he's largely been absent from or in the background of the current story, this is the moment when the second story arc found in the book of Samuel ends. Remember, throughout this book there are 4 men's stories that showcase the rising hope of Israel and their eventual downfall into failure that give our series its title, with each man's tale taking up an increasing amount of the story. First was Eli, who died in the early chapters of the book. Then was Samuel, who just now dies. Then there was Saul, who is in his time of failure and descent. And finally we have David, who is still in his time as rising hope. But the death of Samuel means a couple of other things to the present story. First, Samuel was one of the few people who was present at the anointing of David to kingship. One primary witness to the factual event no longer available to give testimony to David's claim. So there's now more weight given to Saul's denial of David's place. Secondly, history has often shown us that major changes in a king's policy or demeanor happen after a key advisor dies. The question arises, will David continue to perform the will of God after his greatest ally, Samuel, has died? This is a dangerous time, politically speaking, for the nation of Israel, full of questions and doubts about what will happen now. And it is here that we find ourselves in the story. Samuel died, and all Israel mourned for him, mourned for the great prophet who led the change of Israel from theocracy with the occasional judge to monarchy. And they buried him in his home. But there was at least one Israelite who would have wanted to be there at the burial for his old friend. It's David, who still had to be on the run, mourning for Samuel in the seconds between setting up and tearing down the temporary base for his men. David had to move from one part of the Judean wilderness to another part of that desert. But since, along that move, David would interact with a couple of people who have yet to be introduced to the story, the author, who has taken up writing this book after its starting author Samuel has died, gives us a quick statement of who these two are. The first of this newly introduced pair was a man named Nabal. However, the author makes sure to front-load the man's wealth and prosperity before giving his name. The man had a fortune in livestock, 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, all of which fed in an area of Judah called Carmel, which means orchard or garden. It was one of the very few places near Judah's desert wilderness that had plenty of green. Plus, this shows us the when. It's sheep shearing season. The time of this man's year when everything was amazing. This was payday. And a very good one at that. But why would the author choose to withhold this man's name until after his wealth is described? Well, that's because this man's name, Nabal, means fool. Many biblical scholars doubt that this was the man's actual name, since few parents would give their child such a derogatory name. But we do have to factor in that the people in this story do refer to the fitting nature of the man's name. Therefore, if Nabal wasn't the man's name given by his parents, it was still at least something that people did indeed call him. Possibly a nickname of sorts that he bore in ironic defiance. But everybody who knew him understood that there was no irony in the moniker. The end of verse 3 also tells us that Nabal was a harsh man with questionable morality, and he was a Calebite. This would mean he was descended from the line of Caleb, the counterpart to Joshua of the two spies that gave a good report to Israel back when the conquest for the land of Canaan was happening. However, given the general negativity of the descriptors for Nabal, I would question if the author meant to emphasize the meaning of the name Caleb instead of Nabal's lineage. See, the name Caleb means dog, and we're not talking about the faithful and loyal pet of today's dogs, but rather the feral mongrels who would snap at anybody that drew close. Thus, Nabal was a snarling beast of a man. But standing in opposition to Nabal is the second new character for the story, his wife, Abigail. Verse 3 has nothing but glowing praise for the woman. As opposed to her foolish husband, Abigail was discerningly wise, and quite the looker as well, a woman who was amazing in both mind and beauty. And so, with the introductions made, we come to the circumstance that leads to a confrontation. 1 Samuel chapter 25, verses 4 to 17. David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. So David sent 10 young men, and David said to the young men, "Go up to Carmel, and go to Nabal, and greet him in my name. And thus you shall greet him. Peace be to you, and peace to your house, and peace to all that you have. I hear that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm, and they missed nothing all the time they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we have come on a feast day. Please give whatever you have at hand to your servants and to your son David." When David's young men came, they said all this to Nabal in the name of David, and then they waited. And Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed from my shearers and give it to men who come from I do not know where?" So David's young men turned away and came back and told him all this. And David said to his men, "Every man strap on his sword." And every man of them strapped on his sword. David also strapped on his sword. And about 400 men went up after David, while 200 remained with the baggage. But one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, "Behold, David sent messengers out of the wilderness to greet our master, and he railed at them. Yet the men were very good to us, and we suffered no harm, and we did not miss anything when we were in the fields as long as we were with them. They were a wall to us both by night and by day. All the while we were with them keeping the sheep. Now therefore know this and consider what you should do, for harm is determined against our master and against all his house, and he is such a worthless man that one cannot speak to him." We see that David heard about the major payday that Nabal had. But see, the thing was, those were the shepherds near whom David and his men had been traveling during their own wanderings. As we see affirmed by Nabal's own servants in verses 15 and 16, David's warriors were an extra layer of protection for the shepherds. No bandits would want to be that close to several hundred soldiers. And very few predators could find food in an area where that many men had to hunt in order to supplement their limited supplies. And their supplies would be limited because David didn't allow his men to act like bandits. They never stole food or animals from any other people existing around them. These soldiers were kind and helpful to the people finding themselves as desert neighbors. And so, because Nabal's payday wouldn't have been so great without David's men's presence, and because they never stole a thing from him for all their trouble, David sends a few of his younger soldiers to humbly ask Nabal for a little something from his great windfall. It's not like this was an uncommon thing. Often those who found themselves in the midst of a feast would be at their most generous, and would be willing to give at least something to those in great need. Given the circumstances, David could have demanded a share in the profits, because of his men's time and energy. He could have pulled the "I'm God's chosen king" card out, and proclaimed that he was taking his fair share. But David didn't do any of that. No, he humbly asked for whatever was at hand. He continued the actions of one who had learned humility even as he asked for such a small thing. Humility to consider himself a lesser person in comparison to Nabal, as we see when David calls himself Nabal's son in verse 8. And in verse 6 we see David telling his soldiers to begin the whole thing with blessings of abundant peace. Peace to you, peace to your house, and peace to all that you have. This is the epitome of "we have come in peace." David's request doesn't come with threat or compulsion. No, there's a desire for peace to be maintained between them. But Nabal, he didn't see it that way. He lived up to his reputation as a harsh man when he spoke to David's young soldiers. In verse 14, Nabal's own servant recounts his attitude towards the men. The servant says that Nabal railed against them. This is a verb based off of the word for hawk or similar birds of prey, a predatory shrieker that strikes out of nowhere. And we see that this was true in verses 10 and 11, where his words are shown. Nabal acts like he'd never even heard of David, in whose name they come. But we know that Nabal had indeed heard of the name, because he then asks, "Who is this son of Jesse?" Not only does he actually know who David is, but he even knows Saul's favorite term of derision for him, son of Jesse. Nabal is a pro-Saul person, as we see in his use of terminology. This pro-Saul stance is likely something that's true of many people in Carmel, since Saul had made a good enough impression on them in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 12, that they built a monument for the king. And to a pro-Saul citizen like Nabal, David seemed like nothing more than the little usurper that Saul had consistently colored the younger man to be. We can see this all the more in the double meaning of Nabal's next words. There are many servants these days who are breaking from their masters. This David in whose name you come is nothing more than an unruly servant, seeking the demise of his rightful master. And how do I know that you're not just doing the same thing, saying you're a servant of David when you've broken away from him? Fickle people who desert one master are just as likely to desert another. After this dispersion against David, Nabal then moves on to the defensive. Why should I give my bread and my water and my meat to the likes of you? 3 times the word "my" appears for emphasis. These things are his, not David's. That fugitive servant doesn't deserve a thing, and is only here to steal my things. I won't cave to anyone's protection racket. So David's men return to him empty-handed, but full of anger, ire which spreads to David, at which point David calls everyone to strap on his sword, and they all strapped on their swords, and David strapped on his sword. Did you notice the parallel triplet here? Just as Nabal said the word "my" 3 times, we get a triplet of strapping on swords, one for each selfish word of Nabal. David may have begun with words of peace, but after such a harsh refusal, 400 armed soldiers no longer mean peace. Meanwhile, one of Nabal's servants goes to the lady of the house. Maybe it was an offhanded comment, or maybe the servant was worried about what would happen because of it, but either way, Abigail hears word of the ordeal, and she realizes the weight of the situation, partially because she agrees with the assessment of the servant about her husband. Nabal is a worthless son of wickedness, a man who would never justly judge a situation. So Abigail knows it's up to her to resolve this situation, something that reminds David of the lesson of humility that restrains a hand from violence. 1 Samuel chapter 25, verses 18 to 31. Then Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves and 2 skins of wine and 5 sheep already prepared, and 5 seahs of parched grain and 100 clusters of raisins and 200 cakes of figs, and laid them on donkeys. And she said to her young men, "Go on before me, behold, I come after you." But she did not tell her husband Nabal. And as she rode on the donkeys and came down under the cover of the mountain, behold, David and his men came down toward her, and she met them. Now David had said, "Surely in vain I have guarded all that this fellow has in the wilderness. so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him, and he has returned me evil for good. God do so to the enemies of David, and more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him." When Abigail saw David, she hurried and got down from her donkey and fell before David on her face and bowed to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, "On me alone, my lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears, and hear the words of your servant. Let not my lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my lord, whom you sent. Now then, my lord, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt, and from saving with your own hand. Now then, let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my lord be as Nabal. And now let this present that your servant has brought to my lord be given to the young men who follow my lord. Please forgive the trespass of your servant, for the Lord will certainly make my lord a sure house, because my lord is fighting the battles of the Lord. And evil shall not be found in you so long as you live. If men rise up to pursue you and to seek your life, the life of my lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living in the care of the Lord your God. And the lives of your enemies he shall sling out as from a hollow of a sling. And when the Lord has done to my lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince over Israel, my lord shall have no cause of grief or pains of conscience for having shed blood without cause, or for my lord taking vengeance himself. And when the Lord has dealt well with my lord, then remember your servant." Amid all the feast day preparations, Abigail sets herself the task of speeding about to collect a proper gift to David and his men. She gathers a larger gift than would normally have been given, and even includes a few foods that could be kept for longer-term rations. Good items for soldiers who spend long periods of time away from civilization. She thought about what they would actually need, not just the few scraps that were left over from the feast. Then Abigail had her servants load up enough donkeys to carry it all and sent them on ahead of her. But she didn't tell Nabal a single word about it. She'd save the family, even if her worthless husband deserved death for his foolishness. The camera pans from her descent down the shadow of the mountain and moves to David and the army heading up the same path. And we hear David speaking out his frustration. "I was good to that man, and how does he repay me? Nothing but harsh words. He'll get what he deserves. If there's a single man left alive among his whole house, let me be struck down." Two things about these angered words of David, both of which point us back to the previous chapter. First, notice the statement about how Nabal had returned David's good with evil. If we recall last chapter, Saul had been cut to the heart by David's humility that had returned the king's evil with David's own good actions. David had been praised because of how he had returned good for evil. Yet here, David's anger burned to return evil for evil. Sure, Nabal wasn't the Lord's anointed, but the humility that returns good in the face of others' evil should still reign in the life of God's people. Just because this is a slightly different situation shouldn't change the heart of the man. We shouldn't set the heart of God aside just because this occasion is different from the last time. It's not like we get to return this person's evil for good, but this person over here, that one we get to do evil for evil. No. It should always be returning good for evil. Secondly, in case our echoed ire missed the connection between this chapter and the last one, the author shows a particular phrasing in David's words that give a rather direct connection. That is, if we're given the actual translation of the Hebrew instead of the PG version. See, when David promises that come next morning there won't be one man left to Nabal, the term he uses for males in Nabal's house doesn't carry the niceties that good little Christians wish to speak. Those looking at the old King James Version might already know the colorful description. So I'll just quote that translation here. "If I leave of all that pertains to him by morning light any that pisseth against the wall." Now, I'm not bringing this up for the sake of bathroom humor, but because the reference to bodily functions that we associate with the bathroom should really direct our minds to the previous chapter. Especially since David's returning good for evil has been showcased when he didn't kill Saul while he was utilizing the facilities. These are little hints that David should have realized were reminding him of the previous chapter's lessons. The humility that found a non-violent option isn't just meant for the Lord's anointed, but for all people. Just as how David shouldn't have sunk down to the sneaky assassination of Saul's ways, now he also shouldn't sink down to the foolhardy and hawkish ways of Nabal. But at present, David's anger blinds him to his own foolishness. So an example of humility needs to be obvious for him to get the reminder. And that is what Abigail's arrival does. Notice how the second she sees David, she falls to her knees and then puts her face to the ground. Falls to her knees, then face to the ground. This is the same humble position of vulnerability that David had shown Saul, just in the last chapter. And her words echo David's previous humility as well. She refers to him as her Lord, a position of greater standing than she, and she continues to call herself his maidservant. I mean, I felt tired repeating all of the "my lords" and "your servants" when I read this passage. And it's a bombardment of humility that's needed in order to make David see the reminder of his need to humbly find another option for vengeance. In verses 24 and 25, Abigail asks David to lay all the blame on her, because she didn't know anything about the servants being there. Her husband Nabal should be disregarded, because he's a worthless man. She repeats her servant's assessment of Nabal from verse 17. He's a man who lives up to his foolish name. She should have been aware of the situation to broker the gift, for she would have given a generous offering, as David could clearly see, given the surrounding donkeys laden with food and rations. Abigail's words in verse 26 seem to show that David's actions from the last chapter had been made known to the public, since she refers to David's hand being restrained from blood guilt, restrained from taking vengeance on his enemies. She follows that up with a curse against all of David's enemies, to let them be like the foolish Nabal. As she continues and asks for forgiveness, Abigail continues to invoke the work of God in David's life. He's sure to have a royal house because he's the one acting as God's agent of justice. He's already doing the job of a king, so he should continue to promote justice instead of evil. And in verse 29, she speaks of David's place as one kept by God, when she alludes to the two types of bags that slingers would keep, one for food and the necessities of life, and the other for stones, one to keep and one to throw away. But this is also an illustration that directly connects to David, whose own rise to fame was because of slinging a stone. Throughout all of this, Abigail proves her wisdom. She offers the gift which went on ahead of her, and then asks for forgiveness while in a humble stance. She uses wordplay to ingratiate herself before David, based off of the name of her husband. And she speaks of David's own deeds, both humble and great, without laying it on too thick, all the while speaking of God's presence in his life. She's sure that God's chosen king will reign, but his actions should bring about God's restoration to his humble people, not revenge that's good only in the king's own eyes. And at the very end, she asks that, when the Lord has dealt with David, he should remember this humble maidservant. This repeated lesson struck David so hard, as the irate foolishness is seen clearly in the mirror. 1 Samuel chapter 25, verses 32 to 38. And David said to Abigail, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you, who have kept me this day from blood guilt, and from avenging myself with my own hand. For as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, who has restrained me from hurting you, unless you had hurried and come to meet me, truly by morning there had not been left to Nabal so much as one male." Then David received from her hand what she brought him, and he said to her, "Go up in peace to your house. See, I have obeyed your voice and have granted your petition." And Abigail came to Nabal, and behold, he was holding a feast in his house, like the feast of a king. And Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was very drunk. So she told him nothing at all until the morning light. In the morning, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, his wife told him these things, and his heart died within him, and he became as a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. The triplet of phrasing returns in verses 32 to 33. Only it's not a triplet of selfishness, nor a triplet of swords ready for war. No, it's a triplet of humble blessing. Blessed be the Lord who sent Abigail. Blessed be her wisdom of humility. And blessed be Abigail because she restrained David's hand from blood guilt, from David seeking his own vengeance instead of allowing God to resolve the vengeance in his way. 3 blessings which ended in a return of peace. Remember, David had offered peace in his greeting from the beginning of this chapter. And although war had come so close, it was because of the wisdom of humility that peace returned. Humility that restrained David from foolishness. David grants Abigail's petition, like the wise and humble king that he was meant to be, and sends her back without fear of warriors killing all of the wine-filled feast-goers. The story follows Abigail, who returns from a king who nearly acted like a fool, and finds her husband, the fool who feasted like a king. Since he was deep in his cups, Abigail kept the events to herself, that is, until morning. after the sunrise time frame that David had given in his foolish vengeance. It was then that Abigail told her husband what she had done. Interestingly, the passage says that she told him when the wine had left him, which some take to mean as he was relieving himself, literally when a particular liquid was leaving his body. It's an ironic moment, if true, given how much relieving himself is in relation to Saul. But regardless, Abigail told Nabal the truth, and the words sobered Nabal so much that his heart died, and he became like a stone which is flung away by the slinger. About 10 days later, he died. God's vengeance for his own, shown in a timely manner here. And as the Lord had dealt well with David on this occasion, David did indeed remember Abigail. Only his intentions were to make her more than a maidservant. 1 Samuel chapter 25, verses 39 to 44. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Blessed be the Lord who has avenged the insult I received at the hand of Nabal, and has kept back his servant from wrongdoing. The Lord has returned the evil of Nabal on his own head." Then David sent and spoke to Abigail to take her as his wife. When the servants of David came to Abigail at Carmel, they said to her, "David has sent us to take you to him as his wife." And she rose and bowed with her face to the ground and said, "Behold, your handmaid is a servant to wash the feet of the servants of my lord." And Abigail hurried and rose and mounted on a donkey, and her 5 young women attended her. She followed the messengers of David and became his wife. David also took Ahinoam of Jezreel, and both of them became his wives. Saul had given Michal his daughter, David's wife, to Palti, the son of Laish, who was in Galim. When news of Nabal's death reached David's ears, he again blessed the Lord for all that has been done in the situation, including keeping David's hands from blood guilt. Then he sent servants to bring Abigail back to him. He intended to make her his wife. There's a lot that can be said about the questionable nature of David's polygamy, not only in the fact that he'd been married to Michal, who was handed over to another by Saul, but also in the introduction of Ahinoam of Jezreel. But this isn't the time or place for that discussion. Regardless, he called Abigail to be his wife, a woman of wisdom and beauty for the soon-to-be king. And notice how her humility continued even in the calling. She refers to herself as David's maidservant, a servant to wash the feet of her Lord's servants. Perhaps this reminder of humility, so pure that a person is willing to wash the feet of others, is a good place to come to our concluding application. An act of humility that leads to a restoration of peace. There are many in our lives who will mistreat us, hate us, speak poorly of us, refuse any sort of kindness or request. Foolish people who will live down to the name of Nabal, the fool. But we who follow Jesus should not return evil for that evil. After all, our Lord called us to love our enemies when they hurt us. Pray for those who persecute us. Turn the other cheek, give the cloak as well as the tunic, go the extra mile, give to the one who begs, and never deny a request for borrowing something. We're to be people known for our generosity. Sure, there's a need for wisdom as well. But in this culture where people would rather put down and hate and cancel others just because they hold a different position, have nothing to do with those from another side except to criticize and belittle and scream over them, we're called to something different. A different way. The way of humility. So let's restrain ourselves from joining others in their foolish actions. Even if the war is warranted because of their foolish wickedness, let's seek the wisdom of humility that puts an end to the conflict God's way.